Why does a grown man cry every single time a 7-year-old girl sings the same 4 lines of a song nobody taught her? That's not a riddle. That's what happened in the east stairwell of Bellwether Tower every Thursday afternoon for 6 weeks before anyone with the power to do something about it finally noticed. Margaret Chen built Bellwether Capital from a card table in her sister's garage into a 41-story building, with her name carved into the lobby marble. She had a net worth that needed 3 commas to write out and a corner office on the 38th floor, with a view that made the rest of the city look like something she was renting out by the hour. She had not cried in front of another human being in 11 years, not at her father's funeral, not at her divorce. Not once. Daniel Reyes pushed a cleaning cart through the east stairwell every Thursday at exactly 4:15, because Thursday was the day the foster placement office on the 2nd floor ran its supervised visitation hours, and the stairwell was the quiet exit families used when a visit ended badly and a child needed somewhere to fall apart that wasn't a hallway full of strangers. He'd been on the cleaning contract 11 months, he knew which step creaked. He knew which families came back and which ones didn't. He kept his head down, and it wasn't shyness. It was something with more weight to it than that. Stay with this one, because what happens in that stairwell is going to take you somewhere you don't expect, and by the end you're going to understand exactly why some songs refuse to stay buried. 4 years before that Thursday, Daniel had a daughter named Mara. She was 6. She had her mother's stubborn chin and her father's habit of narrating everything she did under her breath, like a tiny sports announcer. She had a song. Not a real one, not one you'd find anywhere, just 4 lines she'd made up herself at bath time when she was 3. About a duck who couldn't find its way home, and a lighthouse that waited up for it anyway. She sang it constantly, off-key, confident, completely unbothered by whether anyone was listening. Daniel used to record her singing it on his phone just to have it, the way you save things you don't yet know you'll need to save. Mara died of a sudden cardiac arrhythmia nobody had caught on a Tuesday, in her sleep, 3 weeks after her 7th birthday. Daniel found her in the morning. He has never in 4 years found a way to tell that sentence. So it costs him less to say. It doesn't get smaller, you just get better at carrying it without anyone noticing the weight. His wife left 14 months later, not cruelly, just slowly, the way people leave a house that stopped feeling like a house. He didn't blame her. Grief takes up a room, and not everyone can keep living in a house with that room in it. He'd been a high school music teacher before. Choir, mostly some piano. He couldn't walk back into a classroom full of kids who weren't his daughter and stay upright through it, so he found work where nobody expected him to talk. Cleaning contracts, paid the same whether you had something to say or nothing at all, and Daniel by then had nothing he could say out loud. He still had the recording. He had never once played it back. He knew exactly which folder it lived in, and he had built his entire life around the discipline of never opening that folder. Stay with me, because the moment a stranger's voice cracks that discipline open is the moment this story actually begins. The girl's name was Joy. She was 7, in the system for 14 months on her 3rd placement, and she had a habit caseworkers had stopped trying to correct of singing under her breath, constantly minus in hallways. During intake interviews, in the back of cars on the way to visits that sometimes went well and sometimes didn't. Nobody had been able to trace where the song came from. Her case file had 3 different notes from 3 different social workers, each one some version of patient hums a recurring tune, origin unknown, presumed self-soothing behavior. On a Thursday in March, a supervised visit with a relative who ultimately wasn't approved ended the way some of them do. Which is to say, it ended with a 7-year-old sitting on a stairwell step with her knees pulled to her chest, because the stairwell was the only door between the visitation room and the parking lot. And sometimes you just need 4 walls that aren't asking you anything. Daniel came around the landing with his cart at 4:17, 2 minutes behind his usual time, because the 2nd floor men's room had needed extra attention. He heard it, before he saw her. 4 lines, a duck. A lighthouse waiting up. He stopped the cart so fast the bottles on the top shelf rattled against each other. He has told exactly one person since what that sounded like from the outside. He said it sounded like someone had reached directly into the folder he'd spent 4 years keeping shut, and opened it without his permission, in the middle of a stairwell in front of God and a mop bucket. He didn't say anything. He couldn't have, in that first second, if his life had depended on it. He just stood there with both hands on the cart handle, and the tears came before he had any say in the matter at all, silent, fast. The kind that arrive without warning, because the body decided something the mind hadn't caught up to yet. Joy looked up. She had the particular directness that kids in the system develop early, the kind that comes from having had to read adults' faces for danger more often than comfort. "Why are you crying?" she asked, not alarmed. Just cataloging information, the way she cataloged everything. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his wrist, the gesture of a man trying to undo something that's already happened. "Sorry," he said, "that's minus where did you learn that song?" Joy considered the question with real seriousness. "I don't know," she said. "I've always known it, it's about a duck and a lighthouse," Daniel said quietly. Joy's eyes went very wide. Nobody had ever known the second part without being told. "How do you know that?" He didn't have an answer he could give a 7-year-old in a stairwell at 4:19 on a Thursday, so he gave her the only true thing he had. "I used to know someone who sang it," he said. "A long time ago." Joy studied him with the focus of a much older person. "Did they go away?" "Yeah," Daniel said. "She went away." Joy nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already half suspected about the world. She scooted over 6 inches on the step, which in the language of a 7-year-old, who has been moved through 3 homes in 14 months, is the equivalent of opening a door. Daniel sat down on the step below her, because some instinct older than thought told him not to sit beside her, only near her, low enough that she'd never have to look up to find him. "Will you sing the part you know?" she asked. He hadn't sung it out loud in 4 years. His voice came out rough and uneven, on the first line, and steadier by the third. And Joy watched him the whole time with an expression that had stopped being about the song and started being about him. "You sing it different than me," she said when he finished. "Sadder." "Yeah," Daniel said, "I expect I do. Don't look away yet, because what Margaret Chen sees on a security monitor 2 floors up is about to make her stand up out of her chair without remembering she's done it." Margaret Chen had installed the camera in the east stairwell herself, 18 months earlier, after a break-in scare that turned out to be nothing. And she had never once reviewed the footage personally, minus that was a security team's job, not a CEO's. But on that particular Thursday, her assistant had pulled up a clip for an unrelated reason, a liability question about stairwell access during visitation hours, and Margaret happened to be standing behind her desk when the frame loaded. A man in a maintenance uniform sat 2 steps below a small girl in a yellow cardigan, his face wet, his shoulders shaking slightly. While the girl sang something too quiet for the audio to catch clearly, Margaret had seen a great many things on a monitor in her career. She had never seen anything that made her chest do what it did in that moment, which was tighten suddenly and completely, around something she couldn't immediately name. She had her own reasons for that tightness, reasons that had nothing to do with the man on the screen and everything to do with a girl of her own, 4 years gone, who Margaret had not allowed herself to think about in any sustained way since the funeral, because thinking about her in any sustained way was a door Margaret kept as firmly shut as Daniel kept his. Margaret Chen's daughter, Sophie, had been 8. She had died of the same condition, the same kind of sudden, silent cardiac event that takes a child in their sleep and leaves the rest of the world, looking for someone to blame, when there is devastatingly no one. Margaret had thrown herself into bellwether capital with a fury that looked, from the outside, like ambition, and was, from the inside, the only available alternative to lying on the floor of her daughter's empty room indefinitely. She had built an empire on top of a grave she had never properly visited, because visiting it meant stopping, and stopping meant feeling the whole thing at once. She did not know, standing at her desk, watching grainy footage of a janitor crying in a stairwell, that the song the child was singing had been written by a different little girl entirely. 4 years and 1 borough away, by a man whose loss mirrored her own so exactly it would have seemed implausible in fiction. She only knew that something in her had recognized something in him, the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in years, the moment you hear it spoken by a Stranger, she asked her assistant for his name. Daniel Reyes, the assistant said. Cleaning contractor, no incidents on file used to teach music. I think minus it's in his original application. Margaret looked at the frozen frame on the screen a moment longer. Find out what that song is, she said. Stay with this, because the answer is going to take longer to arrive than anyone in that building expects, and what it costs to get there is going to surprise even Margaret. The next Thursday, Margaret did something she had not done in over a decade of running Bellwether Capital. She left her office during business hours, for a reason that had nothing to do with a deal, a meeting, or a number on a screen. She told her assistant she needed 30 minutes, gave no further explanation, and took the elevator down to the second floor instead of up to the rooftop conference suite, where she was supposed to be reviewing a term sheet. She found the stairwell door propped open with a rubber wedge, the way it always was on visitation Thursdays, and she stood at the top of the first flight, out of sight, and listened. Daniel was there. So was Joy. And so, this time was the song sung between them, back and forth, like a conversation. Neither of them had words for any other way. Margaret had not planned to say anything. She had told herself she was simply confirming what the footage showed, gathering information the way she gathered information about everything, methodically from a safe distance. But there is a particular kind of safe distance that collapses the moment you're standing 8 feet from a sound that's been living rent-free in the unfinished business of your own chest for 4 years. She came down the last few stairs without entirely deciding to. Daniel looked up first. He recognized her immediately, minus everyone in that building did. The way you recognize weather minus, and something in his posture braced. The old reflex of a man used to being told he was somewhere he shouldn't be. Miss Chen, he said, starting to stand. Don't, Margaret said. It came out quieter than she meant it to. Please stay. Joy looked between the two adults with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a child assessing whether the grown-ups in the room were about to do something interesting, or something boring. Are you in trouble? She asked Daniel. I don't think so, Daniel said carefully, watching Margaret. Margaret sat down on the step across from them, in a tailored blazer that had never once touched a stairwell floor in 18 months of ownership, and she didn't seem to notice or care. That song, she said, where does it come from? Daniel's jaw tightened. It was my daughter's, he said. She made it up. She's minus. She passed 4 years ago. Margaret's hands, folded in her lap, went very still. And the girl sings it, she said, not quite a question. Joy's known it as long as anyone can tell. Nobody taught it to her. Margaret looked at Joy for a long moment, and something passed across her face that neither of them could fully read, grief and disbelief occupying the same square inch of her expression at once. My daughter had the same condition, she said finally, the same minus sudden arrhythmia. 8 years old, 4 years ago. She said it the way you set down something heavy. You've been carrying so long your arms have forgotten how to do anything else. Her name was Sophie. The stairwell went very quiet. I haven't said her name out loud at work in 4 years, Margaret said. She seemed almost surprised to hear herself say it now. Joy, watching both adults with the seriousness of someone deciding whether a piece of furniture is about to fall over, said, maybe the duck found 2 lighthouses. Neither adult had an answer for that. It was in its way, the most precise thing anyone had said all afternoon. Stay with me, because what happens over the next 6 weeks is going to look, from a distance, like nothing at all minus and up close, like everything. Margaret started coming to the stairwell on Thursdays. She told her assistant she had a recurring off-site meeting and left it at that. Nobody questioned a woman who'd built a 41-story building, disappearing for 30 minutes a week. People who run empires are allowed their mysteries. She brought a folding stool the second week, because the steps were hard on her knees, and she never explained that either. Joy began saving up things to tell her minus a drawing, a fact about octopuses, a complaint about her current placement's cooking, minus the way children save things up for the one adult in their week who reliably shows up and reliably listens. Daniel and Margaret didn't talk much at first, not directly, not about anything beyond Joy and the song and the small mechanics of a Thursday afternoon. But grief, it turns out, doesn't need much room to recognize itself in another person. By the 4th week, Margaret had told Daniel about the empty room in her house she still hadn't packed up. By the 5th, Daniel had told her about the recording on his phone, the one he'd never once played back. Why not? Margaret asked. Because once I hear it, that's it, Daniel said. There is no more recording I haven't heard yet. Right now there is still one thing left of her I haven't used up. Margaret understood that with a clarity that frightened her slightly, because she had a closet at home she hadn't opened in 4 years for precisely the same arithmetic. On the 6th, Thursday, Joy asked a question that neither adult had prepared for, because children rarely give you the chance to prepare. Can the duck have 2 dads? She asked apropos of nothing, halfway through a drawing of a lighthouse with what appeared to be racing stripes. Or does it have to pick? Daniel and Margaret looked at each other, over the top of her head, and in that look was an entire conversation neither of them had said out loud yet, about what exactly the three of them had quietly built. In a stairwell over 6 weeks without anyone's official permission, it doesn't have to pick. Margaret said slowly, "Why do you ask?" Joy shrugged with the specific nonchalance children use to disguise the most important question they've asked all month. "No reason," she said, "just wondering." Oh. Don't look away yet, because someone in that building had been watching this entire arrangement and not with kindness. Bellwether Capital's chief operating officer, a man named Preston Glade, had been quietly maneuvering for 18 months to position himself as Margaret's successor, on the theory that Margaret's well-documented intensity was a liability the board would eventually tire of, and that a calmer, steadier hand minus his hand minus would be the natural correction. Preston was the kind of man who smiled with his whole face and meant approximately none of it, who called junior staff by the wrong name twice before quietly correcting himself, in a way that made the mistake look like warmth rather than carelessness, and who had spent a career mastering the particular art of making control look like concern. He had noticed Margaret's Thursday disappearances. He had in fact had someone follow up. He arranged to be in the lobby on a Thursday when Margaret came up from the stairwell, blazer slightly creased, eyes a little red in a way she thought she'd managed to hide. "Margaret," he said, warm, easy, a hand briefly at her elbow, the touch of a man establishing territory while denying he'd done any such thing. "I've been meaning to catch you. The board's been asking about the Hendricks acquisition timeline, and I want to make sure we're aligned before Thursday's call." A pause. "Calibrated, is everything all right? You seem minus distracted, lately." "I'm fine," Margaret said. "Of course," Preston said in the tone of a man who has decided not to believe you and wants you to know it without saying so. "I only ask because the board responds to consistency, and there has been talk minus nothing serious, just talk minus about whether you've had quite as much bandwidth recently. I'd hate for anyone to get the wrong impression." He smiled. "I'm only looking out for you." It was, Margaret would later recognize, an almost perfect specimen of the genre, concern weaponized as surveillance, care used as a leash. "Is there something specific you'd like to ask me, Preston?" "Just that I heard you've been spending time with one of the cleaning contractors, and a child from the foster placement program." He said it lightly, the way you'd mention the weather, except weather doesn't usually carry an implied question about liability and optics in the same breath. "I'm sure it's nothing, I just want to make sure Bellwether isn't exposed to anything minus unconventional." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you for your concern," she said, in a voice that had closed 100 deals and ended several careers with exactly that level of stillness. "I'll let you know if I need it." She walked away before he could arrange his face into the next move. But Preston Glade was not a man who let a closed door stay closed if there was a way to pry it back open later, quietly, fro underneath. "Stay with me, because what Preston does next is going to threaten the one thing Joy has finally found steady enough to hold on to minus, and that is not a mistake he gets to make without consequence." 2 weeks later, Preston filed what he called a duty of care concern with the Buildings Facilities Oversight Committee, and separately, with the Foster Placement Office on the 2nd floor. Framing the Thursday stairwell visits as an unauthorized and unsupervised arrangement between a contracted employee, the company's CEO, and a minor in state custody, he used careful words. Unvetted, unsupervised pattern of contact outside appropriate channels. None of it was technically false. All of it was designed to make something tender look like a liability. The result arrived. On a Thursday morning before the visit could even happen, a notice that Daniel's cleaning contract was being suspended pending review, and a separate notice to Margaret's office that the placement agency was temporarily restricting Joy's stairwell access, out of an abundance of caution, effective immediately. Joy was not told gently. A caseworker who'd never met her before that week informed her, in the clipped procedural language of someone reading from a form, that her Thursday visits with the maintenance employee were paused indefinitely, and that her case manager would discuss alternative arrangements. Joy, who had spent 14 months learning exactly how much weight to put behind hope before it cost too much when it was taken away, did not cry in front of the caseworker. She waited until she was alone in the placement office bathroom, and then she cried the way children cry, when they've already half expected the worst and it's arrived anyway. Which is somehow worse than crying from surprise. Daniel found out from a text message while he was loading his cart for a shift that no longer existed. He stood in the supply closet for a long time before he could make himself walk back out into the hallway. Margaret found out from her own assistant, 40 minutes after the fact, and the first thing she felt was not anger. It was something closer to recognition, minus the specific, sick familiarity of watching someone use careful, procedural language to dress up cruelty as caution. She had built a career reading people. She knew exactly what this was. She called Preston directly. "You did this." "I filed a concern," Preston said, smooth as ever. "For the company's protection, and frankly, Margaret, for yours. People are starting to talk." A CEO disappearing weekly to sit in a stairwell with a contractor, and a foster child minus it doesn't read well in a profile. And it certainly doesn't read well to a board that's already wondering whether you're as focused as you used to be. He let that sit a beat. "I'm sure you understand." "What I understand," Margaret said very quietly, "is that you've just taken something from a 7-year-old child who has already had more taken from her than anyone in this building could imagine. In order to make yourself look prudent in front of people who will forget your name in 5 years. I understand that completely, Preston." She hung up, before he could arrange a response. "Stay with me, because what happens in the next 48 hours is the part of this story that decides everything minus, and it doesn't happen in a boardroom first. It happens on a sidewalk." Joy did the only thing 7-year-olds know how to do when an adult system takes something away without explaining it in language they can use. She ran. Not far, not dramatically, just out the side entrance of the placement office and down the block toward the bus stop, where Daniel sometimes waited after his shift. Because in the entire architecture of the last 6 weeks, that bus stop was the only landmark that had ever reliably led to something good. She got 2 blocks before a caseworker caught up to her, gently, no harm done, but the 11 minutes in between were the longest 11 minutes of Margaret's adult life. Because Margaret was the one who got the call, and Margaret was the one who left a board prep meeting mid-sentence and actually ran, in heels, down a Manhattan sidewalk. Something she had not done since she was young enough not to know better toward the address the caseworker gave her. She arrived to find Joy sitting on the curb outside a bus stop. The caseworker standing a respectful few feet back, and Daniel already there. Having come straight from a contract, he no longer technically had, kneeling on the sidewalk in front of Joy at her exact height, not touching her, just present, the way he'd learned, 4 years ago. On a much worse day, that presence sometimes has to arrive before words can. "I just wanted to find the duck part," Joy said, when Margaret crouched down too, breathless, heels forgotten. "I wasn't running away. I just wanted to find the part that still made sense." Margaret's throat closed around something she didn't have a name for yet. She looked at Daniel. She looked at Joy. She looked at the caseworker, and then at the small ordinary, devastating fact of a 7-year-old explaining with complete clarity that the only stable coordinate she'd been given in 14 months had just been taken away by people who'd never once asked her opinion on the matter. "Nobody's taking the duck part away," Margaret said. Her voice was not the voice she used in boardrooms. It was lower, rougher, entirely unrehearsed. "I promise you that. I will fix this. Stay with me," because 40 hours later, Margaret Chen walks into an emergency session of her own board with a folder. And what's inside it is going to end Preston Glade's career, in exactly the kind of room he thought he was protecting. Margaret called the session herself. She had spent the night reviewing everything Preston had ever filed, every concern, every duty of care memo he'd generated over 18 months. And a pattern emerged the way patterns do for people who've spent careers reading numbers for a living. Every concern Preston had ever raised had eventually cleared a path toward consolidating more decision-making authority into his own office. The duty of care framing wasn't about duty, and it wasn't about care. It was a tool, used consistently, the way a lockpick is a tool, and Joy and Daniel were simply the latest lock. She also had something else. A facilities staffer, named Renata, who managed contractor scheduling and who had quietly disliked Preston for 2 years after watching him take credit for a cost-saving initiative that had actually been her idea, had come to Margaret the night before with her own folder, internal emails in which Preston had explicitly instructed that Daniel's contract be flagged for termination, regardless of review outcome, weeks before the official review had even been opened. The conclusion had been written before the process designed to reach it. He told me to make sure the paperwork looked clean, Renata said, sliding a printed copy across Margaret's desk. I didn't like how clean he wanted it to look. Margaret stood in front of the board the next morning, the same board Preston had spent 18 months courting, and she did not raise her voice once. 18 months ago, I would have told you Preston Glade was one of the most careful, conscientious executives in this building, she said. I would have been wrong, in a very specific way. He is careful, he is not conscientious. There is a difference, and it took a 7-year-old foster child, and a man who cleans this building's stairwells to teach it to me. She laid out the timeline. The duty of care memo filed before any actual incident had occurred. The termination instruction predating the review it was meant to justify. The pattern, across 18 months, of concerns raised exclusively in moments that happened to consolidate authority toward Preston's office. He used the language of protection to dismantle the one stable relationship a child in this building's care has had in 14 months. Margaret said, he did it carefully. He did it, so it would look prudent in a memo. I would like the board to understand exactly what prudent cost, in this case, and exactly who paid for it. Preston, 2 seats down, had the particular stillness of a man recalculating in real time. Margaret, I think we should discuss this privately. This isn't, you filed it publicly, Margaret said. I'm resolving it publicly. She turned back to the board. I'm asking for his removal, effective today, under Section 11 of the Executive Conduct Policy, for misuse of internal process for personal advancement. I have the documentation. Legal has reviewed it. The vote took 11 minutes. It was unanimous. Stay with me, because what happens after the vote is the part of this story that has nothing to do with boardrooms at all and everything to do with a stairwell, a song, and a folder Daniel had kept closed for 4 years. Daniel's contract was reinstated within the hour, with a formal apology, that he accepted quietly and without much ceremony, because ceremony had never been the point. Joy's Thursday visits resumed the following week, this time with full, explicit, written authorization that nobody could quietly dismantle again, and with Margaret's name on the paperwork as an approved family connection, a term that would, in the months ahead, come to mean considerably more than its legal definition. On the first Thursday back, Joy sat on her usual step, looked at both adults for a long moment, and said, with the gravity of someone who had thought carefully about her wording, I think the duck found its lighthouse. I think it just took the long way. Daniel laughed, the first full unguarded laugh either of them had heard from him in 6 weeks, and something in his chest, long held shut, eased open another half-inch. That night, for the first time in 4 years, Daniel opened the folder on his phone. He sat alone in his apartment with the lights off and pressed play, and he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 4 years. Off-key and confident and completely unbothered by who was listening, singing about a duck and a lighthouse that waited up for it anyway. He cried for a long time, but it was for the first time not the kind of crying that closes a door. It was the kind that finally opens one. The foster placement became a formal one within 4 months, minus not through any dramatic legal maneuver, but through the unglamorous Patient paperwork of two adults who'd shown up every single Thursday for half a year, and meant it. Margaret co-sponsored the home study. Daniel became Joy's father, in every legal sense a system designed for caution could allow, and Margaret became, in Joy's careful 7-year-old phrasing, the other one minus not a mom, but the one who fixed it. Bellwether Capital launched a foster family employment initiative 6 months later, guaranteeing flexible scheduling and priority placement support for any employee or contractor who was a foster or adoptive parent. They named the building's east stairwell minus officially, with a small brass plaque most visitors never notice. The lighthouse landing, Margaret visits on Thursdays still. She brought her own folding stool the first day and has never once needed to explain why. This story was never really about a CEO or a janitor. It was about what happens when grief, instead of being hidden, is finally allowed to recognize itself in someone else's. Daniel didn't open that folder for 4 years, because he thought the last piece of his daughter he had left should stay sealed and safe. It took a stranger's voice, in a stairwell, on an ordinary Thursday, to show him that the things we're most afraid to open are sometimes the very things that are waiting to set us free. If a child's voice has ever reached something in you that you thought was permanently closed, tell us about it in the comments. Those stories belong in the light. And if this one reached you today, leave a like below. It helps more people find their way to stories like this one.